Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Have you ever been in a conflict with someone and came out feeling like a victim? Or do you find yourself in a dysfunctional relationship where communication between each other is difficult? Whether at home or at work, you might find yourself trapped in the dreaded Karpman drama triangle. In psychology, it is used to describe a cycle where we can find ourselves in one of these three common roles: the victim, persecutor, or rescuer. And in this episode, we will be unpacking all of that with our guest, David Emerald Womeldorff. We will dive into how you can learn to escape the drama triangle and feel more empowered in your communication and relationships. Drawing on over 30 years of experience in leadership development, leading through change, self-leadership, and employee engagement, David is the author of 2 best-selling books, The Power of TED, The Empowerment Dynamic, as well as The 3 Vital Questions, Transforming Workplace Drama. Both of his books draw on his extensive experience in the field, and David also served for 20 years as a senior consultant for the Leadership Circle and as an executive coach at the University of Notre Dame's Executive Leadership Program. He shares his framework to inspire individuals and organizations to reach new levels of collaboration through empowering relationships and work from an outcome-focused and passion-powered orientation. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Angela. Pleasure to be here.
Amazing. Well, I feel like your background is quite an interesting one to get to, unpicking drama and helping people not get into drama. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got started into the field that you're in now.
Well, I'll share with you a bit of what I call the story behind the story, which is more on the personal side than the organizational side, in that in the book, The Power of TED, the character David has experienced, begins with him experiencing 3 situations in his life. The one is the passing of his dad, who he's very close to, trying to start a family with his wife at the time, and finding out that he was infertile. And those 3 things were autobiographical. And the reason why I'm starting with that is that at the time, initially, I was working with my wife at the time, who was very introverted, and no blame or judgment here, but she did not want to explore other options. And we were working with a therapist, and we learned about the drama triangle, the Karpman drama triangle. And for those who learn of the Karpman drama triangle, and as you said, the roles of victim, persecutor, and rescuer, when I first heard that, it was a blinding flash of the obvious, in that it just so describes so much of my life. And I had been working one-on-one with a therapist for several months and exploring the drama triangle and other aspects of what was going on. And one morning I was doing what I call my morning quiet time, and a combination of kind of my own form of prayer and often journaling, and I was in a very prayerful space again, and I said, with my eyes closed, as I'm doing now, I said to the God of my understanding, I said, okay, God, I'm ready to surrender my victim stance in the world, but I need to know what's the opposite of victim. And Angela, immediately the word creator came into my awareness. And my eyes flew open because I didn't know what I expected. And that began the journey. I can't say that, I'll use a Christian frame here, but I can't say like on Paul on the road to Damascus that my life was forever changed. But it opened my eyes to, well, if creator's the opposite, or what I now call the antidote to the role of victim, is there an opposite to the roles of persecutor and rescuer. And over many years, because there'd be times I think about it, I forget about it, I think about it, I forget about it. But it emerged over a number of years that what emerged as the empowerment dynamic came forward. But it was that original epiphany that really began the work that I've been doing now for 30 years.
Yeah. And, we talked about how most people, if not everyone, is in some form of drama triangle, at least at some point in their life. And the first step is self-awareness that you are in this drama triangle. Maybe to help the audience understand what is a drama triangle and maybe even help some people catalyze that self-awareness, can you give an example of a common scenario, maybe at work, of the 3 roles in the drama triangle, and then maybe frame it how it could be different in your framework?
That's a large question, but I'll be happy to give it a shot. Thank you. So as it relates to what I call the dreaded drama triangle, and I call it that with the permission of Dr. Karpman, because the roles of victim, persecutor, rescuer really are toxic, if you know what DDT is or was, toxic chemical. And I think one of the things that is really important, without going too deeply into it, as it relates to the role of victim, we are in the victim role. All of us experience being in the victim role anytime there is something that we care about, that we feel we don't have access to. What I sometimes say, a dream that's been desired or thwarted. But I also want to make a distinction between victimization and victimhood, because victimization is something that we all experience as human beings. And I speak of it as on the scale of 1 to 10, that, I'm in the wrong lane of traffic again as the one end of the scale. And all we have to do is turn on the news to see the 10 end of the scale. So victimization is something that is part of the human experience that is different and distinct from victimhood, which is a way of being, a way of moving through life, that I'm powerless, I can't do anything about what's going on for me. And so this work really stands as a challenger, which we'll talk about that role in a few minutes, as a challenger to victimhood while acknowledging the reality of victimization. And in order to be a victim, one must have a persecutor. And Dr. Karpman's triangle was very much around interpersonal relationships, but the persecutor could be a health condition, it could be a situation, a natural disaster, and then the rescuer is kind of interesting in that the rescuer role as an individual is often very well intended. And the rescuer, by the way, does not have to be a person. It could be an addiction. It could be anything that helps one numb out from their sense of victimization. And so in the workplace, it could easily be something like, actually, I was on a call just yesterday with an individual, and he talked about a meeting that he was in, and that they had awareness, or he had an awareness of the DDT. The other person did not, but that he felt like a victim because he was being blamed for something that did not go right. And then his response to the other person was the other person, in a sense, felt like they were being victim because of the defensiveness of the person who was in the victim role. So these roles can be very dynamic, and we can ping pong around the roles. And as we talked yesterday, he was hoping that one of the supervisors would intervene as a rescuer and decide who was right, who was wrong. So that's what comes to mind as an example of the DDT at work.
I think for anyone that is in those positions, it can feel like you're trapped in this cycle where every time you communicate with this person, I'm always playing the role of the victim. Or sometimes even when you're like 50 years old and then you go see your parents, you immediately fall back to the role of a child, even though you're now yourself a parent. When you talk about shifting away from these roles that we automatically fall into to a much more empowering role, can you give us an example of how it could look differently? How can you shift that example that you've just shared to one that is much healthier and much more empowering, so that we don't all take turn being victims, which is not a very empowering state of mind?
Sure. Well, I think in order to do that, let me go ahead and share the roles that are involved in the empowerment dynamic, which again, I characterize as antidotes to the DDT roles. So the antidote to the role of victim is the role of creator. And as a creator, we own our capacity to choose our response to whatever's going on around us. And we can envision outcomes that we want to create, being a creator. The antidote to the role of the persecutor is what I call the role of challenger. And challengers call forth learning and growth. They may be unwanted, they may be unwelcome, and yet all of us, I think, in my experience, can recall a person or persons in our lives who were challengers to us out of a growth and learning standpoint, seeing us as capable and resourceful. And then the antidote to the role of rescuer is the role of coach. And as a coach, and this is not necessarily a professional coach, but as a coach, we can support others and see them as see their creator essence and keep them whole and resourceful and capable, and ask questions that help them process and clarify aspects of their experience. So I'll go back to the example yesterday that as the gentleman was sharing with us how things had unfolded, at one point he kind of called time out. And what he said, and this is kind of a challenger move, he said, here's what I am noticing. Now, he didn't label the other person a victim. He didn't even label himself as victim. But he said, I'm noticing that we're going back and forth as to who's at fault here. And let's instead focus on what's the outcome that we want from this, which is a co-creator move. And what is it that we really want to be co-creating here? And it totally shifted the energy of the conversation.
I love that. And that's the thing that I've learned through this process, because, obviously I was so excited to speak with you because, I myself reflect on the drama triangles that I've been in. And it is sometimes as simple as being very careful with your language. It's making sure that when you are trying to understand what's going on, that you don't unconsciously end up blaming the other individual, because then that individual goes into defensive mode and then it becomes this victimhood. Versus, as you said, if you ask the question in a way that we can all be aligned to, for example, I'm sure all of us would like to be able to achieve our goals without having to work overtime. How can we do this together? And so aligning on things that neither party could disagree on is one way in which, as you said, to break the wall between each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Angela, one of the things, as I'm listening to you, one of the we may or may not get a chance to talk about the three vital questions, but the third vital question is about taking action, and there's a framework at a very high level. It's called dynamic tension, which is focusing on outcomes and then focusing on current reality and what's going on in current reality that supports and inhibits the outcome, and then how do we take baby steps in service to those outcomes. The reason why I'm bringing it up is that so much of drama is rooted in current reality. It's like, whose version of current reality is correct here? Let's argue about who's right, who's wrong. If we can align around an outcome that we both care about, then it diffuses 80% of the emotion in the current reality, because neither one of us want that current reality anymore, because we're aligned around something that we care about and that we want to create together.
Yeah, I love that, because often we, for example, in American politics, you hear about how divided Republicans are against Democrats. But often when you look at what they care about, they all just want safe schools. They all just want to be able to send their kid to school and not worry that, that kid might be shot at. They all just want to be able to, manage the cost of living. And these are the outcomes that we can definitely align to, even if we feel that we're standing on opposite end of the spectrum.
Right.
And maybe let's go there. Let's go. Can you outline to us what are the 3 vital questions? Because I feel it's such an important part to kind of think about getting out of that drama.
Well, I appreciate that. And before I do that, I'll do that very quickly. But on your point about, and I don't want to go into American politics too deeply, but one of the things that fascinates me is you're absolutely right that what we want as human beings, whether Republican or Democrat or independent or whatever, are largely the same things, where the division and the dysfunction comes is the means to those ends. And again, I don't want to go deeply into that, but if we could focus on what is it we are aligned and united around wanting, and then bring some discipline to where do we disagree, where, I think we would make a lot of progress. So the 3 vital questions. So the first of the 3 vital questions is, where are you putting your focus? And are you focusing on problems, or are you focusing on outcomes? And actually, the model that underpins this comes from my long history with the leadership circle. And in the problem orientation, our focus is on problems. Our inner state is one of anxiety. It's fear-based anxiety. And then the behaviors that we engage in are reactive behaviors, whether it's fight, flight, freeze, or appease. Whereas in the outcome orientation, our focus is on what we care about, the outcome that we want to create. It taps into an inner state of caring or passion, which then gives us the energy for taking the creative, what I call baby steps in service to that outcome. So those 2 mindsets create very different environmental conditions, if you will, especially in an organization, that feeds into the second vital question, which is, how are you relating? And how are you relating to others? How are you relating to your experience? And frankly, how are you relating to yourself? And are you relating in ways that produce or perpetuate drama, which is what happens when we're problem-focused, anxiety-based, reactive in nature? Or are you relating in ways that empower others and yourself to be more resourceful, resilient, and innovative? And those are the relationship roles, which are the empowerment dynamic that we can cultivate in service to the outcomes that we want to create. And then I kind of alluded to this, but the third vital question is, what actions are you taking? Are you merely reacting to the problems of the moment, which is what happens when we are really entrenched in that problem-focused and what I eventually call victim orientation? Or are you taking creative and generative action in service to outcomes that you want to create? And that's what happens when we are taking action in service to outcomes, harnessing, again, what I call dynamic tension.
From my own personal experience, it's one thing to intellectually understand what you've just said and then actually live it. I find that when, I also did the leadership circle, and it would be really great to kind of unpack some of that as part of this chat. But I definitely noticed that, that there are parts of sometimes when I lead from a place of fear. It's reacting to the problem. And I think what would be really helpful for our audience is, what are the steps that you can take that kind of actively shift you from not being in that reactive space and to be much more in that creative, empowering space, when often our behaviors are almost automatic. And then the next thing you know, you've traveled down 10 miles down the road and you've gone, oh, why am I here? I wanted to be there. But, I've started a series of actions or steps that now it's hard to walk backwards to and restart how I should be starting, if that makes sense.
Sure. Well, first of all, Angela, I want to normalize our reactivity as human beings. I go reactive at times. Don't think for a moment that I live my life 100% out of the empowerment dynamic and the outcome creator orientation. That's just not part of the human experience. I think the measure of progress is, do we catch ourselves more quickly and make conscious, empowered choices? And to me, here is, well, I also want to acknowledge that this work, I feel blessed that I've been able to frame the work in ways that are simple for people to grasp, but they are anything but easy. And that is really important to acknowledge. And so again, being able to catch oneself, to self-observe. And so to me, the real key is to be able to consciously pause. Part of what we talk about in our work is having some sort of a pause practice. And this may sound, again, very simple, but I know from my own experience, because I've spent, I would say, I won't do percentages, but a good part of my career inside organizations, that if I was in a meeting where drama was really being played out and I was feeling myself triggered into the drama, one of my practices was to feel my feet on the ground. Because if I can consciously feel my feet on the ground, I have now become conscious of how I'm feeling, and I may not make the right choice in that moment, but I've vastly increased the probability of a more empowered interaction, whether it's asking a coaching question, whether it's asking, so wait a minute, what's the outcome that we're after here? Or what is it, what is the, when it comes to conflict, one of the techniques I used to use is, what's the nature of our disagreement here? Is the disagreement around goals and outcomes? Is our disagreement, back to American politics, around means, around how we get to the outcomes? And if we can become conscious, what Ron Heifetz from Harvard calls getting up on the balcony and being able to self-observe, that to me is the key. And so some form of pause practice, whether it's paying attention to your breathing, or as weird as it may sound, one technique is looking around a room and 5 red objects. And noticing 5 red objects, because what that does is it shifts you from, and I'm not a deep student of neurology, but it shifts your focus or your brain activity from that amygdala react, fight, flight, or freeze to the conscious function, the prefrontal cortex, I think it's what it's called, and being able to then make some choices.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even something as simple as breathing, just by taking very deep breaths and calming yourself down, it'll take a minute or two, but you're switching your mind or your body from what they call the sympathetic nervous system, which is very action oriented. I'm going to do all these things, to parasympathetic. And you can then, as you said, get out from the amygdala and into much more the executive function of the brain to actually make the parts of the decision that you could probably be more proud of. And I think often when we are so action biased, we forget that by taking action, that if it's the wrong action, you're not saving time. I think we think about, we're so time poor. We have all these things to do. I just have to take the step. And sometimes just even taking a pause, observing, will save you time. So I think that's really important. And can we maybe talk a bit about, in the context of all your experiences, working with leaders and in the workplaces, what are the common causes of workplace drama that you've noticed?
Wow. So you mentioned time pressure just a moment ago, and I would say that is, for a lot of leaders, time is a persecutor, and the pressure of time. Um, and I think the other piece, if it's okay with you, this would be a good time, I think, to say a little bit more about the leadership circle. In that, one of the things about the leadership circle that has been so impactful for me is that it's arrayed in a circle. I don't want to go deeply into it. And there are competencies at the top that are creative competencies that are either task or relationship focused. The bottom half, which is the unique part of the leadership circle, are reactive strategies or tendencies. And these reactive strategies or tendencies, and I hope I can come back to your question here in a moment, really come out of several influences, but especially out of the work of a woman in the 1940s named Karen Horney, who was very curious about how do we develop a sense of identity, and how do we feel safe in the world, and how do we move forward in the world. And she, in observing especially children, determined that by the age of 10, we tend to adopt three different strategies, one of which tends to become our dominant, and I'll share mine in a moment. But the three strategies are what she calls moving against. In the leadership circle, we refer to that as controlling, got to be right, got to be on top, etc. Kind of the opposite of that is she called it moving toward, which is, we call it complying in the leadership circle, to go along, to get along, to be pleasing, etc. Very related to the rescuer role. By the way, controlling is very related to the persecutor role. And then the third strategy is the child that sees chaos around them, and so the strategy is to move away from. And in the leadership circle, we call it, I just went critical. Sorry, I just lost the middle piece, but it's about distancing, it's about playing it safe, etc. And to me, that's really related, not directly, but related to the victim role. And actually, you can look at all three of those aspects as having a victim tinge to them. So the reason why I bring that up is that
David, the one that you're thinking of is protecting.
Thank you. Protecting. Yes. So again, it's about protecting oneself from the chaos around them. And the reason why I bring that up in relation to your question is I think that what I've learned from the leadership circle and from the work that I've done is, as leaders, so one of the things is that we adopt, so I said I would share mine. When I was up until about the age of 9, my strategy was one of controlling, was I was the middle of 3 boys. It was like, and then I realized if I got in a fight with my older brother, I'd lose. If I got in a fight with my younger brother, I'd get in trouble. So I flipped to complying, and I became kind of the quintessential, I refer to myself as a recovering rescuer. And the reason why I wanted to refer to the leadership circle and the reactive strategies is that we come into organizations with those strategies often unconscious to us. And the huge value of what Bob Anderson, the longtime friend and colleague, has created with the leadership circle is that it can bring to conscious awareness what those reactive strategies have been. And then again, we've got the capacity or the capability, once we're conscious of it, to make a shift into more creative, in their language, and more empowering competencies and ways of relating and taking action.
And it's so interesting how much of your childhood, or something as simple as what position you are in, like you're the youngest or the oldest, in dictating which role you end up playing in the family, and then you take those roles again unconsciously into the workplace. Yeah, I think that was one of the most powerful things for me, was to when I got my leadership circle results, really reflecting on how I thought I was showing up versus how I was actually showing up, and how often I was playing the reactive side of the circle rather than the creative side. And I think for me, a lot of this work is about moving towards the aspirational, and also still giving myself like self-compassion when I'm making the same mistakes again and again, and definitely being very frustrated when I play out behaviors that I know is not great, and I'm like, why did I do that again? But always it takes time to reflect rather than when I'm in the moment kind of thing. Yeah.
Sure. So again, I think to me the measure of progress is it 2 steps up to 1 step back, and there are always going to be steps back, and to have that self-compassion and to say, oops, here I go again. And, I think as a leader, one of the things I would say is that at least in certain situations, now this is not a general rule, but in certain situations, if you catch yourself going reactive, is to own it and to say, wait a minute, Angela, time out. I'm just aware that and not that you are triggering me, but I'm feeling triggered or I'm feeling reactive. Can we take a 5-minute break? Can we come back and reconnect to what we're trying to accomplish here? That kind of vulnerability is really helps shift out of the drama into a co-creative relationship.
So maybe if we're halfway through our chat, maybe if I quickly summarize what we've chatted so far. What I'm hearing from you is, whether it's personal or in the workplace, most dramas come from a place where we're acting in behaviors that we are conscious or mostly unconscious of. These are often even coping mechanisms that we've developed since childhood that we then play out in roles with different people in the organization, depending on their personality and their sort of comfort zone when they're in a place of fear or a place of stress. What you shared to break that cycle is something as simple as taking a moment to pause, to be mindful, to take a deep breath, in order to reframe the way that we speak, to not be defensive, to not be blaming, but to come from a place of being outcomes oriented so that we can all be agreeable about something, or to come from a place of curiosity in the way we ask questions, in order to not make the other person feel defensive. And if we take the time as well to, build that self-awareness about how we're showing up, whether it's doing something like the leadership circle or any other type of evaluatory type of program that helps you show up as a better leader and a better person in the workplace. Would you kind of say that's a fair summary of where we got to?
I think it's a very fair summary, and I just want to add one thing, and that is, and it's connected to the leadership circle and to our reactive tendencies or strategies, is that I don't want to overly position those as bad. You use language earlier that those strategies helped us move through our lives and for many of us contribute to our success. However, that what happens, and this is part of what the leadership circle helps expose, is those strategies that we often draw on unconsciously that have contributed to our success then get in the way of our capacity to be conscious and effective leaders.
Yeah. I think I love the saying, what got you here won't always get you there. Let's transition then to leadership. It's when you think about creating healthy workplaces that are not toxic, leaders play a huge role in either contributing to the toxicity or removing it. Often people underestimate that being a manager or being a leader is not just you are the best in your technical field and therefore you have all the skills to manage a team, but it's actually in many ways a separate skill to learn and develop. What have you learned through coaching leaders through organizational development on what really works in creating leaders at scale, I guess, especially when we're thinking larger organizations where these things can play out more often.
Well, part of what you're describing, Angela, is so true. I can't tell you how many coaching conversations, leadership circle debriefs that I interact with someone who has been promoted into their quote unquote leadership or management role. And it's what I call a dub the manager promotion. It's like, Angela, you're really good at XYZ. So I'm going to dub you manager. Now go forth and manage people doing XYZ. Now it just makes a lot of sense that you would draw on what made you successful. And so one of the traps for a lot of managers is that what made you successful may or may not make one of your direct reports successful. So I think part of the role of leader, and I do make a distinction between leader and manager, I think the two are intertwined. But to me, leaders are outcome focused. They are, again, I'll use leadership circle language, that they're both task focused and relationship focused. And part of the relationship focused is discerning what is it that motivates the people that you are leading. And for some people, they need to be pushed, so to speak. And I mean that in a non-judgmental, but they need to be really pushed. For others, it may be more that they need to be encouraged. And one of my very favorite little turn of phrases that unlocks things for a lot of leaders, so I'm going to go ahead and share it, is to move from tell first, ask second to ask first, tell second. And what I mean by that is that, again, out of the traditional notion that leaders or managers should have the answer. So if I were to come to you and say, Angela, you've got this issue, what do you think I should do? And you're operating out of your traditional expertise, you're likely to say, well, David, I think you should do A, B, C, and D. And then you might say, what else have you thought of, David? The flipping that to ask first, tell second, as I come to you, I share the situation, you maybe ask me some questions for context, and then you say, David, what have you thought of so far? And you're sitting there thinking A, B, C, and D, but I'm likely to say something like, well, I think I should do A, B, D, and E. Now, you've got a great opportunity to reinforce my thinking and my development by saying, David, I think A, B, D, and E are great ideas. I would add C. And I'm going to leave much more highly motivated because I am going forth with my thoughts that you reinforced and added to, and a creative idea made it on the table that if I was just relying on your expertise may not have made it on the table. So this ability to see those around you, whether they're direct reports, whether they are colleagues, as creators in their own right, and that they have ideas and thoughts that can be really part of the co-creating process. Ask first, tell second is one of my go-to mantras.
Yeah, I love that. I think the thing that people also often, when they think about leaders, especially in the old school way of thinking, is that leaders are responsible for results. And in that context, it's actually very easy, and I definitely fall victim to it, which is that I then prioritize the tasks that will get the results and managing against those tasks so that we get those results. And actually, so much of what will unlock even higher value is when you also can do both managing the task, but also empowering the people in the relationship side. And I don't know if you're able to talk about this, but one of the things that was also hugely aspirational for me was learning about, for example, how when you are able to cover both the context of the relationship side and the task side, then you actually are a 10x better leader than everyone else. And that the people who are like the top 1% leaders actually lead in a very different way. I don't know if you could share what excellence look like in high-performing leaders?
Gosh, it's a great question, and I have to admit, as I shared with you before we started the chat here, that it's been a while since I've been directly involved in the leadership circle. Although I've got a lot of really great colleagues and friends still very involved in it. And what I would say is, to me, it is that being able to balance task and relationship. And if one is overly focused on relationship, then results can slip. If one is overly focused on results, then relationships can slip. So I think that what really makes for an effective leader who is able to see their responsibility of holding the context for both task and relationship. One of the things I would challenge is that the further one goes in their leadership career, the less their value add is on having the answer. Their value add is in supporting the relationships and the direct reports to have the answer. And so one of the things that I have found a real challenge for a lot of folks, especially at what I call the cusp between managing and leading, is letting go of being the answer person. And so a lot of the role of leadership is to develop the context and the what needs to happen and why it needs to happen from a strategy standpoint, but letting go of being the author of the how. So there is a framework that I won't go deeply into called the solution space. And as a leader, the role of the leader is to define the solution space. What needs to occur, by when, what are the constraints, etc. But then empowering, well, I want to take a step back. It certainly is empowering, but being able to say, so Angela, now that we're clear on the boundary conditions, I want you to come back in a couple of days and tell me how you're going to approach accomplishing this within the boundary conditions, rather than how I would do it given my expertise. That is a really empowering practice to engage in.
And I totally agree with that, moving away from being the one telling people how to do things, because then you're actually limited, in terms of your ability to execute at the highest level. Because the way I think about it is I love to be the dumbest person in the room and hire lots of people who are smarter than me that can tell me how to do something. And as you said, my role as a CEO is to actually just give them direction of like, here's the outcome we're trying to achieve. Here's what we need all the different parts to be working together on, and then leave the different teams to do that. But I think it's also really important to close the loop in a sense. So if we give people that autonomy to go and explore, go and define how they solve the problem, sometimes they might do it in a way that is just not right. And then the role of feedback really is very important. But sometimes, actually probably most of the time, people don't see feedback as a gift, and they see it as something that, you're blaming me, or, you make me feel bad. What is the role of effective feedback in this process of empowering communication and being outcomes oriented in your results?
Let me take a couple of levels of that. One is back to this idea of solution space. If the direct report comes up with a how that violates one of the boundary conditions, then it's, and I don't mean this as softly as it sounds, but it truly is a learning opportunity. So what is it about the approach that you were taking? And as a leader, it could be that I didn't define the boundary conditions as well as I could have, should have. So this is, again, a co-creative process. Just literally this morning, our community of practice had a 1-hour session around giving feedback from a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, if you're familiar with Carol Dweck's work. And part of being able to give feedback from a growth mindset is to not use judging language like, Angela, that was really good, or Angela, that missed the mark. Is to give feedback from the standpoint of, here's what I saw happening. So it's an action focus. Here's what I saw happening, and let's explore that together. How did that contribute to the success, or how did that detract from the success? But it's being able to give feedback without blame or judgment. And so much of our feedback language carries with it inherent judgment.
And so what I'm really hearing is it's very important for individuals to be mindful of how they're communicating in a way that's non-judgmental. Have you had experience where even when someone communicates in that way, because of an individual's previous trauma or experience, they hear it the way that creates defensiveness, even if the way it's communicated isn't? Or do you find that actually that never happens as long as it's done in a way that's non-judgmental?
Actually, you cannot guarantee that it will come across as non-judgmental. So I'm going to share with you a story that I received from an early adopter of this work, who's a executive coach. He was coaching a gentleman who was the number 2 person in this high growth organization, and the person he was coaching was totally bored with his job. And yet, in their coaching conversations, my friend would raise the question of, what are other possibilities? What other kinds of things could you do? And the coachee would deflect, would not go there. And after really noticing this pattern, after 2 or 3 coaching sessions, he decided, and this is, by the way, coming from the challenger role in the empowerment dynamic, he decided if he saw the pattern again, he was going to challenge his coachee about it. Gets into the conversation, as you can guess where this is going, raise the question, deflection, and my friend and colleague said, time out. He said, I just want to share an observation that I have, and I could be wrong about this. That's an important quality. It's like, I could be wrong about this, but what I've noticed is that when I raise this question, you have a tendency to deflect or not want to go into that. And his coachee said, you're right. We're done. There's the door. And kind of fired him on the spot. Now, there's a good end to this story, but my friend went back home. It was the last meeting of the day. Sat down, given his lifestyle, with a glass of wine, told his wife, I need an hour. He did kind of an after-action review, and he said, there's a few things I might have done a little bit differently, but I was coming from what I call learning intent and was not judging, was not making him wrong. It was sharing an observation. By the time he finished a glass of wine, he said he slept well that night. And about 3 months later, the client called him back and said, we need to keep talking, and ended up moving on. But there's not a guarantee that we can be as conscious as possible, coming from a learning intention, that the other person, because the other person is as a creator, is free to choose their own response. And so if their response is defensiveness, it is good for us to self-reflect, and is there something I could have done a little bit differently? But the choice of reaction response is with the other person.
We talked about it in the context of the individual, but does an organizational culture, or whether, say, for example, if there's psychological safety in the organization, so even if the manager is operating with the best intent, if the employee is in an organization where generally feedback is not done in a safe way, it's not surprising that they take it in a negative light. Does the role of, I guess, culture impact communication happening in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. Culture does. And, one of the phrases that I remember from my days with the leadership circle is, culture gets created in interaction at a time. And, what are the norms and and again, in this meeting I was in this morning, one of our practitioners was sharing that he's 4 months into a new job, and he wants feedback from his direct reports about what he's doing well, what he could be doing better. And the culture has been so feedback resistant, and feedback has always been in that negative, performance evaluation, what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, fix the things that you're doing wrong, etc. And so he's really, paddling upstream against the culture. And yet, what I would say is the way that we change a culture is it's going to sound simplistic, but is an interaction at a time, is being clear about what our motives are. And that's one of the things he took away from it is the need to really set context for people that, I remember early in my career when I was internal, and I've been using Bob Anderson's framing of the what I call the loop diagrams, the problem and outcome orientation, for years and years and years. And I remember a pattern that would come up is that, and this speaks to culture, so bear with me, that a pattern would come up where someone invariably would say, do they know what you're teaching us? And my response over time was, well, I don't know who they are that you're referring to. And where this would come up, give you context, Angela was in a high potential middle management to leadership transition group, large organization. I'd say, I don't know who the they is that you are referring to, but here's what I can tell you is that to the people around you, you are they. And what is it that they are saying about who you show up in terms of empowering language or disempowering language? So again, it begins organizational change and organizational culture. Yes, there's a great deal of contribution that the top of the house makes, but it can be bottom up, it can be middle out. And so to me, it really is an interaction at a time.
And that's great. And that's also a very empowering way of framing it, right? So that every individual have their role to play. Yes, you might not be the CEO, but your little behavior or interaction can influence up as well. I guess along those lines, in the context of let's try and think about shifting toxic workplaces to be less toxic. And in the context of toxicity is this idea of conflict or unhealthy conflict. So maybe you could share, when is conflict unhealthy or versus, I guess, normal? When should we intervene as individuals, to, for example, use the TED dynamic to break the cycle versus, okay, this is just a normal conflict. I don't have to actively as an individual intervene.
I think that litigious culture tends to be, in my experience, much more toxic because, again, it's who's right, who's wrong, rather than a culture that is focused on outcomes, shared outcomes, and how do we do the work of, in most organizations, we don't spend the time necessary to articulate what are the outcomes that we want to create. And whether it's in service to our clients, whether it's in service to our internal or organizational culture, et cetera. And so I think that, to me, the hallmarks of toxicity are, some things that can be measured like turnover or, human resource complaints or those sorts of things. And yet, functional conflict can be very, very important to creating outcomes. And I kind of alluded to this earlier in a different context, but if we are in disagreement, let's step back and what's the nature of our disagreement? Are we disagreeing on outcomes? Are we disagreeing on means? And let's get clear about that. And where are we in agreement? We also often skip over that. Where are we in agreement? And then let's define where we are in disagreement. We can be disagreeing without being disagreeable. I know that sounds a little, but we can be disagreeing and still do that without blame or judgment and seeing one another as co-creators, both wanting to get to the best outcomes for the organization. So I don't know if that helps, but that's what comes to my mind.
That makes sense. We spoke about, that some of the challenges today in communication is the fact that there are 5 generations in the workplace.
Yeah.
And that, again, it's conveyed sometimes in different languages. But what are the extra challenges that we need to be mindful of today compared to previous generation, and maybe even in the context of hybrid working?
Boy, great question. And before we started our chat, I mentioned that that's a topic that our community is going to take up next month. I think that on the one hand, I think when it comes to drama, and frankly, when it comes to empowerment, we are all human beings. So it's not generationally dependent. It's not, frankly, in my experience, it's also not culturally dependent. But the way we language and the examples that we use can be quite different. And I can't come up with a really good example right now, other than to say that the other thing that comes to mind is, again, the roles in the empowerment dynamic are creator, challenger, and coach. I think the coach role is really important in this regard, in asking questions for clarification or questions about, what is it that you really care about? And one of the things that I shared with a gentleman this morning is being able to ask, what do you need? What do you need more of from me? What do you need less of from me for you to be successful in what you're doing? So again, I think it's finding ways of languaging the co-creative relationship in ways that fit for the different generations.
And that's great to hear that, from your experience, there isn't a huge amount of difference in the context of generations or culture. Is there any extra consideration for, whether someone is neurodiverse?
I think that as a leader, being sensitive to the diversity, and again, I'm a big fan of asking the other, what do you want and need from me as your leader? And that is within the context of what you're responsible for. So this is not in any way creating, excuses, but is what do you need from me as a leader to be of support to you in the way you're going after accomplishing the results that you're here to resolve. So I don't know if that helps, but the diversity to me is a really important question, and it's about meeting people where they are rather than trying to get them to see things your way.
And I guess that, you could also flip it the other way around. If you are the employee trying to manage the dynamic, that you can ask the leader, what do you need from me to be able to accomplish your goals? And that might be one way to influence up as well.
I like that. I like that, Angela. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we've covered a lot, and ultimately we're covering the human condition and how we interact with each other. We have a closing tradition here. Basically, could you share with us what is your one wellbeing practice that you do, David, to stay well?
Oh boy, I have a I shared early on in the story behind the story about having a morning practice. I am very committed to, I get up, I set my alarm, or I get up 2 hours before I have to be responsible. And I have my own routine of some meditation, again, sometimes some journaling. I do some inspirational reading. And so I start the day with intentions. What's the intention for the day? And although that is not foolproof, it does help me stay focused on outcomes.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore in the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.